Hello, 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 everyone. We are going to go ahead and get started. If I could have your attention, please. Also doing the live stream, so don't mind this big laptop in my hand. But on behalf of Busboys and Poets, thank you so much for joining us for this discussion with co-authors Asia Martinez and Robert Smith, moderated by Dr. Rachel Grant, about their latest release, The Origins of Critical Race Theory, The People and Ideas That Created a Movement. We can clap up and give it up for our speakers. Thank you. That's what we're here for. If you don't know anything about us, Busboys and Poets is a community where racial and cultural connections are consciously uplifted and a space for art, culture, and politics to intentionally collide. Our Busboys and Poets servers are going to be helping us out throughout the program with putting in orders. I also want to remind you that there will be a Q&A after the discussion, so make sure to be preparing those questions, thinking about those throughout the discussion, and there will be a book signing after the program, and The Origins of Critical Race Theory is here available for purchase. Also, if you are tuning in online and you'd like to get a signed copy of the book, please email us at bookevents@busboysandpoets.com after the program. We have a limited amount of copies here with us tonight, but we will be ordering more and you will still be able to get a signed copy just in case we run out. And a little bit about the book we'll be discussing here tonight. Through archival research and interviews with scholars like Derek Bell, Richard Delgado, and John Stefancic, Asia Martinez and Robert Smith provide the personal side of critical race theory. They reveal that despite the Marxist menace it has recently been made out to be, critical race theory is an organic extension of the civil rights movement, a deeply human and deeply American response to ongoing systemic injustice and inequality. An insightful exploration into the story of a movement, The Origins of Critical Race Theory narrates the hidden influences, fascinating characters, and intellectual struggles that informed critical race theory's inception. And now a little bit about the speakers we have here with us tonight. Dr. Rachel Grant is a scholar and professor at the City University of New York College of Staten Island, where she developed and coordinated the first TESOL program. Her work is informed by critical race and intersectionality theory. Asia Y. Martinez is Associate Professor of Latino Studies at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign and author of the award-winning Counterstory, The Rhetoric and Writing of Critical Race Theory. Robert O. Smith is Assistant Professor of History at the University of North Texas and enrolled citizen of the Chickasaw Nation. He is the author of More Desired Than Our Own Salvation, The Roots of Christian Zionism, and Comprehending Christian Zionism, Perspectives in Comparison. Now I'll pass it off to them. Thank you.
Well, we are so pleased to be with you this afternoon, so happy to be here in DC and to see some friends and so many new friends in the gathering. So thank you so much for being here and joining in this conversation.
Yeah, just my gratitude and thanks. As we were just saying, we are mostly academic book writers. This is our first non-academic book that we've written, and doing the bookstore audience kind of tour is very new for us, and so we're just really excited to be here and to talk about the work and the love that we poured into this project. So now we'll hand it over to our lovely moderator.
I think, is this on?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay, good. Well, first of all, thank you. And this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. It frames my teaching, my research, in many ways, so many aspects of my life. But I'd like to also say that I was supposed to be joined by Shelley Wong, who was a friend and a colleague, but she is really under the weather. She's contagious, so she won't be joining us. She decided to spare us, so she won't be joining us, but we certainly do miss her. I wanted to begin. I have framed about 9 questions. I know there are too many questions for our discussion, but they're fairly generic, and what I intend to do based on the responses, I can edit out questions as we go, making sure that we cover the central questions. But before we begin, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement before we start. And I'd like to acknowledge that we stand on the traditional territory of the Nescata, Koskin, Piscataway people. Land acknowledgement is a way we can recognize indigenous presence in our everyday life and in the educational institutions in which we work. It also means to take up responsibility to consider the history of colonialism, racism, and to respect Native people, past, present, and future. So we will not get to everything.
Mind if I fix the microphone a little bit for you so that
Okay.
you don't have to
No, okay. Great. Okay. Thank you. Great, thank you. When Shelley and I were asked to sort of read the book and provide some questions for this evening, we came up with a number of different themes that I think are addressed broadly. I'm not formulating questions around them, but when we started reading and based on our work, these are things that really crossed our mind as connected to the book. And I'll just go through the list. It includes the centrality of race, anti-blackness, and the erasure of black history and culture, intersectionality, the genocide in Gaza, actions and attacks on free speech on university campuses and broader society, book banning, and white religious nationalism and Christian Zionism. So we see those as related, and of course we thought about this as we were reading. So I'm going to get us started with our first question, and I tend to have multi-phase stage questions, so I'm going to start the first one. Given the current attacks on an erasure of CRT, ethnic studies, multicultural education, and targeting of wokeness in education and the broader society, what suggestions or strategies can you offer to educators to support students whose histories, cultures, and stories are now removed from K-12 and university content and curriculum? How can students who are demonized, ostracized, minoritized, classed, and marginalized be supported without CRT? And a follow-up to that is, in what responsibilities do local communities have in filling the void?
So I think one of the things that is prevalent thematically throughout the book is the realization, and this was a realization I had when we got our copies and I read it again pretty quickly and was like, oh my goodness, we've been here before. This is something that has been a challenge we've faced. This is something that our ancestors and predecessors have definitely rose to the challenge of. And it's not so much thinking of, oh, what are the new things we have to do, but remembering what has been done in the past and that we have the tools. So one more recent example is that I'm from Tucson, Arizona, where ethnic studies was banned in 2010 if you were paying attention at the state level like that. And I was there when that was happening. That ban was focused on the very schools that I went to as a young person. I was in graduate school at the time of these bans. And what I was witness to and activist community support of during that time in terms of the teachers and the students who were dealing with it was exactly what I think is a good lesson for us today, which is we kind of call them, and this is in the spirit of Richard Delgado, who our second chapter covers, these cockroach or cucaracha maneuvers, right? Where you have your shell, you get low and you skitter and you do what you need to do to survive because they're the ultimate survivors. And so if it means changing names, if it means making things more covert or unrecognizable to eyes that wouldn't recognize things for what they are, these are some of the strategies and the skills that we've seen at play all the way back to, I don't know, the start of this nation, but definitely during the post-Brown era up to now, where these bans have happened in a more recent way at the state level and now at the federal level. One of the things that I think is the major lesson in the book that demonstrates that is that if you get to chapter 5, you realize we don't talk about the naming, the actual coining critical race theory until the end of the book. Because as far as our timeline goes in the story within this book, it's that the work of CRT was happening long before it was ever named CRT in 1989. And so the entirety of the book, the story that gets told, is about all those tools, all those key figures, all those leaders and teachers who we can still look to today that brought us to that point in 1989, decades later after the work had been done, where it's like, okay, what are we going to call this thing that we do? Well, what does that mean? That also means that the work exists even if the name has to disappear, change, transform. So that's what I'll say, but.
And then to follow up on that, the effort that we're seeing to attack and erase not only critical race theory, which is really the least important component of it, but to erase the various histories and historical witness of communities of color, that attack has been a consistent attack, especially since 1954 and the Brown v. Board of Education decision. The part of the tracing we do in this book, and we're going to do further in more detail in subsequent projects, is the white resistance to integration, the white desire to maintain racial segregation in all spaces is consistent, and that is part of that is the driving undercurrent of what we are seeing today, that same arc of political activity and desire. So we, in fact, have been here before, and part of what we need to do in our local communities, and that especially includes supporting independent bookstores that provide spaces of conversation and critical inquiry and exposure to alternative ideas that are not mainstream part of the dominant ideology of this society. And this is one of those places. We tell the story in the book about an independent Afrocentric bookstore in Dallas where Derek Bell came to visit multiple times because that was his priority, was to be in these very spaces, to be with you, to tell the stories and the commitments of critical race theory, but even the longer civil rights movement that CRT is a part of. And also remember, talk to your grandparents. They've been through it. Talk to the people who've been in the struggle for decades because they see the patterns that we may not see, right? They know what's been going on, and they can tell you what was happening around them, how the community stood up. And that we are so fragmented today that we barely stand up together. We only do so on limited occasions. But how do we maintain and persist in our harassment of societal power? How do we push back on a consistent basis?
And that's the part that gets us to the second part of the question. What do we do as community? What we've been able to trace and track, especially with Robert mentioning the word harassment, is the community effort that grew critical race theory. It's not the other way around where these academics at Harvard Law somehow influenced the community. No, we don't have Derek Bell without the work he did with the Legal Defense Fund in the 1960s in Mississippi, in Jackson, but also a more rural community called Harmony. And what Harmony was what they called a Black Brigadoon. It was a sanctuary town where core workers and other activists could come and be safe for the night. They could sleep because it was an all-Black community that was armed. They were armed in their resistance in terms of protecting themselves and any organizers who were there to help with voting rights, school desegregation, those sorts of efforts. And we've had the honor and the privilege to not only feature some of those community members in our book in chapters 1 and 3, we are the first to publish the picture of Mrs. Biana McDonald, who gave Derek Bell his very motto, which is, "I lives to harass white folks." He got that from a community member in Harmony, Mississippi in 1964 during Freedom Summer, that he was there in that community learning from these community leaders who were overwhelmingly Black women. And so we've also had the honor and the opportunity to visit both Harmony and Jackson recently and be with the family of Mrs. McDonald, her grandson, Colonel Torrey Jackson, who took us to Harmony. We got to see her house. He told us the stories of his grandmother, and we had that hard conversation because if you hear his title, Colonel, he's an Army person, and Army Reserve, and he is at this same very moment saying, what do we do? What can we do? And we were like, your grandma told you, like she she had the best lesson that, again, taught all of us, but taught Derek Bell and continues to teach, and he didn't disagree with that. Do you want to add to any of that? Okay. Yeah.
My second question was, it struck me as I was reading the book, and it is, on page 67, you write that in moving the discourse forward, Delgado and Stefanik are questioning their own established categories and forms, even going so far as to question if race still needs to be the center of social inquiry, or if it's time to examine more deeply questions of class. Can you comment on whether you see this as an acceptance that race and racism is permanently affixed in American society and that it can never be removed from the equation that determines privilege?
I'll start, but I think I have more to say about that. So that quote in particular comes directly from getting, speaking of honors, getting to work with Richard Delgado and Jean Stefancic throughout this entire book process. They've been involved mostly because this book comes, as far as like the seedbed of it, from Derek Bell's archive that rests at NYU Libraries. And because we were accessing the archive, we were also able to send really interesting questions to the still living founders of critical race theory, like Richard and Jean, and they were responding in ways like, how do you know this? Where did you get this? You know, and because we were in that archive. But it also opened doors like theirs to want to work with us on this project that to them was a unique approach, this storytelling approach to what critical race theory is. And so we've had plenty of opportunity now to sit with them, to work with them, to do writing process of revision in this book, especially their chapter. And they told us that specifically, Richard in particular, that, yeah, maybe it is this time to kind of start looking at class in certain ways, but that is actually one of the original claims as far as tenets are of critical race theory, the permanence of race and racism. And it goes back further than people like Derek Bell. It goes back to his influences and predecessors like W.E.B. Du Bois and Ralph Bunche, who we also talk about Ralph Bunche in particular in the book. So do you want to say more about that?
Right. So part of what that question of the dynamic relationship between race and class and what gets emphasized in analysis, Delgado, in a sense, is also being very playful because he is playful. He's a feisty guy in his mid-80s, and he'll take you on. But he's saying, oh, they don't like critical race theory? Well, don't call it that anymore, right? We don't need that label. We can call it something else, but we're still going to do the work. And the work has always been concerned with the permanence of race and racism alongside the reality of class in the United States and truly globally. And so he's also, one of the funny things about the attack on CRT that's come in recent years, this attack that it's somehow the result of Marxist European critical theory, that's the root. Well, no, it's simply not. Delgado himself is Marxist in his thought patterns and in his writing. He identifies in that way, but that is not the totality of critical race theory, and he never claims that it is, nor should it be. But he uses Marxist tools of analysis, but that does not make CRT Marxist. And so he's playing in that category. While at the same time, we need to take seriously what W.B. Du Bois and Ralph Bunche were saying in the 1930s, that class problems in the United States will not be addressed fully until race problems are addressed in the United States. That these are interrelated categories of analysis and policy. And so you can't address one without the other in this country because race is such a bedrock reality of the United States. And that recognition of the truth of US realities is another deep commitment of critical race theory. Late in his life, Derek Bell said, just tell people the truth. They can handle it. And part of what we find so often is our political leaders are unwilling to actually tell us the truth. And so from our perspective, CRT is simply a straightforward effort to tell the truth about the structures of society and tell you why it's not getting better.
I guess to add one more thing in terms of Ralph Bunche and why his name comes up so often is that one of the beautiful archival finds, I think you found this, right, was we found, and this gets featured in the first chapter of our book, Derek Bell's application letter to law school that he wrote on a naval warship while he was serving in the Air Force during the Korean War. And so right in 1954, when the landmark case was passed, he was headed home on this ship and writing his letter of application to University of Pittsburgh School of Law, and he names 3 black exemplars for himself, 3 heroes, and one of them is Ralph Bunche. And the reason he talks about Ralph Bunche is because he, by the end of his life, wrote a speech that also brought us back to Ralph Bunche in regards to that analysis of race and class that he was aligned with W.E. Du Bois about, but it was also the reason why W.E. Du Bois and Ralph Bunche separated philosophically from the NAACP in the 1930s. And so that was something that was very, I guess, moving for Derek Bell and kept Ralph Bunche for a number of reasons on a pedestal.
Sorry, another detail about that. So this letter, this law school application essay is written in 1954. None of us want to go back to our grad school application essays and, thinks that that's going to be exemplary of our writing. But the copy that's in the archive is so cool because it's all the cross-outs and the edits and all that stuff. It's a developmental copy of the essay. And he names 3 heroes, William Green, who was a judge in Illinois, Ralph Bunche, and Judge William Hastie. Those are his 3 heroes. Bunche was not a lawyer, but by 1954, he was a highly established black leader within international diplomacy. Ralph Bunche had been the person to negotiate the armistice lines between Israel and its neighbors following the 1948 conflict, and later on received the Nobel Peace Prize for that effort. And so he was a major, major African-American leader. And not a lot of folks in 2025 mention Ralph Bunche. He's in a sense been forgotten in this litany of black leadership. But Bell was very conscious of him and continued to be committed to his memory throughout his life.
Okay. I thought about that when in thinking about class. And knowing the phobias and paranoia about Marx and Marxism, here's my next question. Okay. What can we gain from centering class as the center of social inquiry? And can this be accomplished without addressing the role of Marx and Marxism in an analysis of class?
Well, again, I think what can be gained is a tremendous amount, and especially as we internationalize analysis along lines of class, right? And so to de-exceptionalize the questions of the United States. And class analysis is a really important way we can do that, put the United States in its, within the continuum of international realities. Race, however, is unique in this context because of this country being built on the genocide of Native peoples, and so built on stolen land with labor stolen from natives and imported African communities. And so and through chattel slavery. So this racial reality of the settler colonial state of the United States is unique in some ways, also can be compared internationally, but the realities of race in this country, in a sense, stand alone. And so you can't export U.S. racial analysis to other contexts without some modifications. Class analysis, however, can be more international. So there's a really important way that we de-exceptionalize the U.S. in that conversation. But again, this is something that Bunch and Du Bois were talking about in the 1930s with openness, with clarity. But as the Red Scares continued to take hold in U.S. discourses, and especially in the academy, that class analysis got submerged. And so there was a clear separation of racial analysis and class analysis. And now we're back in another era of McCarthyism, where joining those two together makes more sense.
And I guess just in terms of the history of CRT and its scholarship, one of its main founders, Mari Matsuda, talks about in probably her most famous piece, Looking to the Bottom, about how Bunch, but even Frederick Douglass were addressing these the intersection of race and class as issues well before Gramsci was ever even thought of and picked up a pen. And so that's something that is a nice answer to give to those who are making those accusations, that the analysis is coming from that space, that there is a uniquely American component to the way race and class have been addressed by our own homegrown folks.
You know, one of the things that we need to be careful of when we're having these conversations about hot button topics, right, about critical race theory in particular, so the attack calls it Marxist. So then we rush to say, oh, no, it's not Marxist, right? As if we need to disavow that category of analysis. Why would we give up tools when somebody comes up with an attack? And so we are saying its origins are not in European critical theory, but can CRT coexist alongside Marxist analysis? Absolutely it can. Can it exist alongside black radical analysis? Absolutely it can. It draws from that well. And so, liberation theology, direct contribution to critical race theory. And so all these things are interwoven, and the attack should never scare us away and should never cause us to drop our tools on the ground. So that I think is part of the reclamation work that we're trying to do here.
Thank you. Do you see a role for CRT in the analysis of and opposing the genocide in Gaza?
Okay, so just in a more intimate sense, I am on dissertation committees. There's a doctor in this house right now whose committee I was on, Dr. Anna Habib, who does use these tools within the analysis on the several different issues that have gone on in the region, from Lebanon to Jordan to Syria to Palestine. Beyond that, within my own field, which is rhetoric and writing studies, there is another scholar, Bernadita Yunis, who is developing what she's calling Palestinian CRT, using the tools of critical race theory, particularly its storytelling methodology. And we had the privilege and honor to be at a international consultation this past January that Robert was one of the key organizers for, but this international consultation in Jordan on Christian Zionism, and I was able to share my work on CRT and its tool, its storytelling methodology, and pretty much every Palestinian in that room said, who does it better than us? The storytelling as a method. And so where we see a lot of crossover and overlap is absolutely within CRT's methodology, the world over for sure. And that's what we're excited to see, is how folks internationally are taking up that tool and making it their own in varieties of ways that make sense to a lot of us who come from oral history type of traditions and peoples. But the other place that we see that is already in play is coming from our CRT scholars like Cheryl Harris and Ian Haney Lopez, who have studied whiteness specifically, and particular to whiteness as property. And so Noura Erkat has been doing wonders with that concept in application to Palestine that Robert can speak more on.
That was a very full response. So I do, yeah, no, and I think Noura Erkat is the person to turn to. Justice for Some, that legal analysis takes CRT very seriously and shows how it ought to be done in terms of legal analysis. Now, two things, though, come out of this that are very almost technical, but in the appendices of our book, we put forth definitions of critical race theory. One of the things that happened when the attacks started coming was that people said, well, what is this thing anyway, right? How ought we to define this? But hold that too. Because the three definitions that Bell himself offered when he was asked all center storytelling, all center the narrative coming, I got it, thanks, that's all right. All center that narrative that comes uniquely from people of color. And that's the key. And so when we say, can CRT be helpful? Yes, absolutely. Because that storytelling, which provides a counter story to the dominant ideology and demonstrates the legal and policy barriers to the equality we seek, that is a tool that transcends context. But Appendix 3, begins on page 183, as Asia said, at the end of the book, lists the tenets of critical race theory. The permanence of race and racism, challenge to dominant ideologies, interest convergence, race as social construct, intersectionality and anti-essentialism, interdisciplinarity, centrality of experiential knowledge and or the unique voices of people of color, commitment to social justice, and accessibility. Those 9 tenets. If you're not engaging the 9 tenets, you're not doing critical race theory. You could be doing anti-racism work, you could be doing DEI type work, you could be doing all sorts of things. But it's those 9 tenets that guide whether or not something is critical race theory. And so we are very confident that this tool and this set of lenses can be applied, especially to other contexts. And yes, the situation in Israel and Palestine, the genocide that has been perpetrated on the people of Gaza, and the ongoing settler colonial genocidal construct that the state of Israel shares with the United States. Critical race theory provides vital tools for the analysis of those situations and tools for helping us create a world on the other side of those atrocities. So yes, we do believe that CRT is applicable, and more than that, is essential.
Building on that, because when I first agreed to be a part of this event, I had to go back and reread Faces at the Bottom of the Well because I read it in '92. So, and literally I have my copy with me and it is in tatters and marked up. But I went back to it because at that time when I first read it, I really hadn't focused on the storytelling aspect. So I looked at it more as an informational text. So I went back and reread it. So here's my next question. On page 168, drawing from the work of Derek Bell, you indicate that storytelling as a critical methodology has the power to make the perspectives that are shaped by thinking about and experiencing issues of race heard, so dominant classes can no longer avoid the responsibility of listening. Can you share your insights on how we can accomplish this in the current political climate? How can we get them to listen?
Yeah, story is super powerful. It's how we learn. Richard Delgado has said it's like the most primordial thing that we do. And it has been the tool that not all CRT scholars have sworn by, but many of them have from the start. And it was Derek Bell's archive that confirmed that for us. My first book that was on counter story was written more as a hypothesis because I hadn't visited the archive yet. We hadn't spoken to founders yet. And so I was like, I think this is really central. But as soon as we went to that archive, it was confirmed, because one of the things that we show in the book, especially I think it's at the end of both chapter 5 and in the conclusion, are letters that Derek Bell wrote to the founding members of CRT in 1989 following that July meeting they had in Wisconsin, urging them to use storytelling, decentralized storytelling, as the way to move forward with what this new thing was that they had decided to call critical race theory. In terms of the origins of even that as a method, it was inherently pedagogical. It was for teaching. So Faces at the Bottom of the Well features one of Derek Bell's most famous stories called The Space Traders. Such a great story that it was even made into a film by Bootsy Collins for HBO back in the day in a series called Cosmic Slop. You can find it on YouTube. And the power of that story, kind of like what Rachel is pointing to, is that it seemed almost prophetic. And in fact, Derek Bell was accused of being a prophet many times. And I say accused because he always, in a defensive sense, said, no, I'm not a prophet. I just pay attention to history because it repeats itself. And what you see in a lot of his storytelling, not just The Space Traders, is, lessons for the future based on what he was able to gain as insights from the past. So one of the things that I studied in the first book were his particular approaches, but one of the things we found in the archive that confirmed a few things for us is that there was a small scrap of paper where Derek Bell had written, the Bible is full of parables, Jesus told parables, parables are story, I will tell stories. And so that points to, one, his lifelong Christianity, which is undeniable if you are reading his work with that lens. His other bestseller, in addition to Faces at the Bottom of the Well, is And We Are Not Saved, which, if you know, is directly from Jeremiah. And many of his epigraphs are scripture, in addition to his storytelling method. So I studied that in my first book and made a case for it to my field, but it's transcended my field. And so then what we've done in this book that Robert will read next is we demonstrate throughout the entire book counter story in practice, the power of this storytelling, which is why we're in front of you today. This isn't an academic book because of the power of counter story. This is an accessible method that Derek Bell wrote in a very explicit way, 8th grade literacy level, intended for as broad an audience as possible, because even though he's teaching about constitutional law, and you're learning constitutional law, it's through story. So you may not even realize it, but you're still learning it. So we're going to do a demonstration of that with the story from the first chapter. No, the one that I had marked. Yeah. There's another. They're all over the book. Called The Paper Napkin, which is how CRT got its name.
I don't think the new developments tag fully captures our aim, Kimberly Crenshaw said, a skeptical look on her face. I think it sounds generic. We should go for something more, she thought for a moment, provocatively substantive, she finished contentedly. The three others chuckled at her bravado. Crenshaw was joined by Neil Gatanda, whom she met years ago through the Harvard Law School alternative course, and current Wisconsin Hasty Fellows Stephanie L. Phillips and Teresa Terry Miller. It was early in 1989, and this particularly miserable winter in Madison, Wisconsin seemed like it would never end. Thoughts of gathering a motley crew of race crits to the shores of Lake Mendota that July sounded glorious and too far in the distant future. What's the full title again? Maybe it'll help if we all see it in writing, Gatanda suggested. Phillips began scribbling on her yellow legal pad, New Developments in Race and Legal Theory, and then swiveled it around so the group could take a look. They each said, looking thoughtful. May I? asked Crenshaw, gesturing toward Phillips's notepad. Phillips, nodding her assent, pushed the pad across to Crenshaw. So what we know, Crenshaw began, is that we want to attract a specific audience, other misfits, if you will, who are looking for a critical space where race is the focus, but also a race space where critical themes are central, Miller finished. Yes, exactly, Crenshaw affirmed, nodding and smiling at Miller. Okay, I'm hearing critical and race repeated in what the two of you are saying, said Gotanda, so perhaps write those two words down. Right, said Crenshaw, quickly inscribing the two words, trying them out first, as race critical, then critical race, and then a few question marks. I guess what remains foremost on my mind is, what is that substantive thing that holds us together as a group, Crenshaw asked. What constitutes our distinct contribution to the discourse on race and the law? The critique of liberalism, Miller suggested. Well, CLS does that well, critical legal studies. Crenshaw responded, shaking her head. The critique of liberalism plus race theory, Phillips offered. But it's more, something more, Crenshaw said, looking pensive. It's the lived experience, Gotanda said matter-of-factly. Miller, Phillips, and Crenshaw all looked at him as if waiting for him to go on. So he did. Sometimes those who love theory get very lost in the clouds of it and seem to forget theory comes from somewhere. It comes from people, the lives we live, the people we meet, the people we help, the people we fight for and fight with. Theory comes from practice. And I think if there's anything that sets what we do apart from what everyone else does, it's our valuing of the lived experience of people of color. Our belief is that our theories come from this experience, not the other way around. Well, Neil, Crenshaw said, clearly impressed, what I heard you say over and over again is the term theory, but theory in the way we understand it. Gotanda smiled and nodded. Yes. I suggest you write that down.
So, how did we get that story? That story comes from law review articles that were not written like that. And what we did is we reconstructed the narration that does happen in a law review article, mostly in the footnotes. That's where the juicy storytelling is happening. And we were able to, with what was in the main text and in the footnotes, put together and breathe life into the data, if you will, right? We humanized it, which was the whole point of the book, is to make these moments real, human moments of people just sitting in an apartment. It's cold as heck outside, and we're just trying to figure out this thing as we plan for this summer meeting that's going to happen. How real is that? How human is that? How many of us have done something like that?
And so in that one story, that pretty short story, there are 11 endnotes, right, to tell you exactly where we got the information. And one of the things we know is that we're up against bad faith critics of CRT who put some notes in their writing but are really making stuff up. So they have book-length tall tales about what they're saying. We're trying to tell the truth. We're actually trying to get to the truth of the thing. And that's, when you're trying to tell the truth in front of somebody who just doesn't care about the truth, right? That's the situation we're in. But we also know if we don't document it, if we don't be as careful and accurate as we can be, they're going to come after us. And so this is why we wrote the way we did.
Yeah, and the further point to that is, yes, it's story, yes, it's accessible, yes, it's oftentimes entertaining and engaging, but it's heavily and rigorously researched and cited for the, refutation that might come at it. But we also want the audience to be as broad as possible, just like Derek Bell did. We're not making something up, right? We are walking and moving in the wake of these greats who came before us.
I am going to skip a couple of questions because I do want to make sure we have time for the audience to engage too. So this question, is there a story that you were unable to include in the book that you would like to share with us now?
This is kind of an advertisement for our next book. So the archive was wonderful. There were a lot of treasures and revelations that happened while we were there. And one of the things that is in the book that we happened upon is a letter from Barack Obama, president of the Harvard Law Review. He wasn't president yet. This was from 1990, that he wrote to Derek Bell, and that Derek Bell used as scrap paper on the back because Barack Obama wasn't Barack Obama yet. He was just a law student, yeah. And so it was a pretty funny find because it was Barack Obama praising and glorifying Bell and just being like, oh, you're so amazing. And on the back, Bell had notes for something else he was thinking of and gonna write. And it wasn't even, as far as his archive is organized, it wasn't in correspondence where you find a lot of important letters from people like Constance Baker Motley, Thurgood Marshall, Medgar Evers. No, it was in teaching materials because he was a student and it was probably just put right there. Yeah, you can even see a little bit, hold it up, the way it gets copied. If you look closely, you can kind of even see the notes behind the letter, just as proof that, yeah, that's what it looks like. And the archivist didn't even know that was in there because they try to keep letters and stuff by famous people separated so people don't, walk off with them. So that's one of the funny ones. One of the other funny things or amazing things that we found that we had to kind of table for the next book because of how important the find was, but also just because of the focus it would probably pull from the story of this book, is in 1979, Derek Bell was working on a piece of fiction called Dependent Status, and so there's a folder for that where it says Dependent Status, parentheses, fiction. We pulled that folder because we were trying to look at all the fiction and the creative typewriting he was doing for the first part of what we thought the project was going to be. And this folder only has a few pieces in it. The first page is a handwritten letter in pencil. The next two items are the same draft of that, fiction piece called Dependent Status, one with marginalia and different comments and strike-throughs from that pencil writer. The next is by Derek Bell, where he clearly took, the constructive criticism and was revising. And the last one is a clean copy that is a full revision. We photocopied that in about summer of 22, and then didn't look at any of it again until about November, like fall break, when we had time to see what we brought home, and I was going to start writing. And so I was looking at that letter because it said something really interesting in it that I wanted to quote for an article I was writing, but it's signed Love Alice. And I just asked across the room, we sit in chairs sort of like these across the room from each other when we're writing and working. I don't know if you all knew we're a married couple as well. We're co-authors, but we're also married. So we live together. Yeah. And we can talk about that too. It's an interesting dynamic. But I asked across the room, I said, I wonder who Alice is. So go ahead.
So part of the detail was I had gone to New York to the archive with Asia as the copy boy. I was just going to be there to photograph things that came up in the archive. I wasn't really part of the project, and that I was just assisting. Not yet. Well, yeah, not yet. And it was this moment with Alice is what actually made me the co-author on the project. And so that's how big this was. Because when Asia says, well, I wonder who Alice is, well, that activates me. Anytime a question like that gets asked, I go on the deep dive. I'm going to find the answer to that question. And about 10 minutes later, I said, Asia, look at your text messages. And I had the photograph of Love Alice next to a book that was signed by Alice Walker. And it was the same Alice. So in 1979, before The Color Purple, Alice Walker is writing to Derek Bell with constructive criticism on his writing. And that set us off on a whole other historical trajectory. How did they know each other? And why was she able to speak so freely and critically? And why was he so receptive to that? All those questions come up. Yeah, she was, and she's like, class, just like that. And they had met in 1966 in Mississippi. And again, everything goes back to Mississippi with these stories. And so the second book that's with University of California Press is going to be all about the Mississippi foundations of both critical race theory and womanism. and how in Search of Our Mother's Gardens is referencing particular people in Mississippi who also show up in this book. And so that weaving is going to be happening in the story of the second book. It's too big to fit here, right? And so this is the next project.
Okay, that sort of gets to my last question, but I did want you to talk a little bit, and it probably connects to one of the projects you're working on now, and that's the notion of theology, especially Derek Bell with reference to that.
Yeah, theology.
Yeah.
I'll start the answer to that because it's a uniquely DC story, and we wanted to make sure we touched on the DC components of the book because they're in here. So in 1959, when Derek Bell finished up law school, he was having trouble getting hired as an attorney in Pittsburgh, and this is covered in the first chapter of the book. And so what he ended up getting was an offer to work for the Department of Justice in the newly developed Civil Rights Division. So he moved to D.C., and upon coming to D.C., he realized an old friend of his was living here, and her name was Jewel Hairston, and he had known her since Pittsburgh days in the Hill, where they both grew up. They went to school together, high school. She was a year behind him, but they were mates. They were friends. So she was living here at the time as well, and she extended him an invitation to a new church she had helped found called the Church of the Redeemer, that was founded by Reverend Jefferson P. Rogers and his wife, Mary Grace Rogers. So do you want to?
Sure. So yeah, Bell came in '57 to D.C. and well, I've got the book in front of me, you know, and to work for the Department of Justice. And yeah, Jewel Hairston came to him and said, "Hey, you know, we're in the same city now. Why don't you come to this new church that I'm a part of?" Because she had helped to establish Church of the Redeemer, which was an intentionally integrated, racially integrated space in D.C. And the home of Jeff and Mary Grace Rogers became a model for how Derek and Jewel structured their lives. Because the living room was a space of warm hospitality and community-based vocational clarity that served as an intellectual parlor. Originally from Quincy, Florida, Jeff had been aggressively recruited to graduate school by Benjamin Mays, founding dean of Howard University School of Religion. Mays even went so far as to appeal to Jeff's grandmother, Hattie Paramore, a fierce educator and activist in her own right. At Howard, Jeff came to know and study under prominent black theologian Howard Thurman. When Mays and Thurman encouraged Jeff to further his theological studies, the two Rogerses headed to Yale, where Jeff completed a degree in social ethics from the Divinity School, while Mary Grace earned a master's in sociology. Through Mays and Thurman, Jeff became an early confidant of Martin Luther King Jr., heading the D.C. chapter of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, founded in '57. The Rogers' living room would often host SCLC strategy meetings with King, Andrew Young, Wyatt T. Walker, Jesse Jackson, and others. So this becomes Derek and Jewel's mentor in this city. And that was how they modeled their lives together for the decades following.
But beyond that, one of the things that also put Robert on the project, which is actually our third book that is also, it's under contract with Penn State University Press, it is about religion and CRT because of how undeniably lifelong Christian Derek Bell was. We found so much evidence in the archive that Robert predominantly found because of his lens as a theologian and a religious historian, and things that we found marked in the index of the archive as morning prayer, Robert pulled and took a look at and realized they were sermons written by Derek Bell to be delivered at Harvard Chapel under the invitation and direction of Peter Gomes, who was there at the time. And so by the time 69 into the 70s that Jewel and Derek were in Cambridge and at Harvard, they already had been mentored, a decade or so earlier by the Rogerses. Derek's already developing his idea of realism that is directly informed by the work that Reinhold Niebuhr and H. Richard Niebuhr, which is who Jefferson Rogers studied with at Yale Divinity. And so those parlor conversations right here in D.C. were already getting a young Derek Bell kind of formulating toward what he would then go on to start thinking about and teaching at Harvard Law by the 1970s.
All right, last little, this is not theological, but a DC detail. Are any of you government employees? Anybody civil servants here? Yeah. All right, all right. My parents were both FAA employees. So for that time that Bell worked in the Department of Justice, he had a tough time because they found out that he had an NAACP membership, and they said you need to resign your membership because it's a conflict of interest for working in civil rights. And when he refused to do so, based on the example of Judge William Hastie, and there's a lot in here about Judge Hastie in D.C., they put his desk out in the hallway and gave him menial tasks until he was forced to resign from the position. But before he did, he wrote a poem. That we found in the archive. In memoriam, and I won't read the whole thing. Oh, wait, read the whole thing? Oh, gosh. Ring the church bell, sound the death knell. Drape in black, both old and young, gather, gather, brother, sister, while my tale of toil is sung. Come still nearer, you my hearer, come, my voice will fail me soon. Shadows fading in the gloaming herald night's oncoming gloom. I was young once, young and pretty. I had hope then, just as you, but I entered civil service. Oh, if only then I knew. All the tiresome, tedious typing, filing papers, memos, drafts, making phone calls, citing old laws, bickering with office staffs. Ambition's dead now, dead and buried. My woe increases day by day. The future holds but one thing for me, greater work for no more pay. Find new work, cried my parents. Leave the old job, my friends pled. Useless warnings, useless pleadings, courage long before had fled. Murder talent, kill incentive, bury skill neath time and grade. Shackle faith and hope to payday. Thus does man become a slave. Useless efforts, wasted motions, no need now to push or strive. My life schedule clear before me, mortal hell from 9 to 5. Ring the church bell, sound the death knell. 5 years gone is what we mourn. Repeat the ancient ceremony, pin on my breast your badge of scorn. Hear my words, my youthful mourners, the moral in my sad lament. Better sell your soul to Satan than spend your life in government.
He shared that with me. So. Okay, I am finished with my questions, and it's just open it up to the audience,
Yes,
please.
let's please, anything that y'all want to ask or...
Yep, and you can just raise your hand. I'll come bring you the mic. See someone back here is going to start us off. Let's see if the mic works all the way back here. I think so.
What analogies, if any, do you see between the relationship between critical race theory and class analysis and the debate that's going on now within the Democratic Party over why it's lost touch with working people? I'm referring there like to the substitution of identity politics for any class orientation.
You know, identity politics itself has become kind of a misunderstood category, right? And if we take identity politics back to the Gambia River Collective and look at its possibilities in terms of liberative social movement through a race-conscious and ethnicity-conscious and gender-conscious form of seeking policy change, then identity politics can be a powerful tool. If, however, identity politics is only understood as pandering to certain demographic categories, then it loses its liberative power, right? And so even that phrase should be more complicated than how it's usually used in political discourse. My sense is that that original Gambia River Collective use of identity politics is really in line with critical race theory, and that same black feminism is deeply resonant with critical race theory.
And it absolutely is. It's what informs the tenet of intersectionality and anti-essentialism. And so when you look at, especially in the appendix, what is said in that section, it talks about basically what the critique has always been from CRT, which is the critique of ideology, but in this case, liberal ideology, and so the concept of the individual, because that's what gets hurled against folks that want to engage what is being demonized as identity politics, that, oh, you are just trying to do, like this group identity by ethnicity or race or gender or sexuality, and that is not preferable to identifying as an individual, especially the rugged American individual that pulls himself up by his bootstraps and makes it on his own. And what I think anybody who studies CRT and looks at that tenet of intersectionality, but also its twin side of the coin, anti-essentialism, will say is that part of that group identification is for survival and has been historically. But that flip side of the coin, anti-essentialism, I think is key to not forget, because it says although there might be cross-identification along lines of oppression or privilege, there is also the importance of not just grouping people in an essentialized, homogenized way, because there's diversity and difference within those categories. And so that happens all the time. You see with like the Latino vote, right? Whatever something like that means.
And so in terms of political party categories, we wouldn't say that either party is anywhere close to getting things right in terms of how people are addressed in their specificity. And so that's, I think, critical race theory with its tenets, especially of intersectionality and the unique voice and perspective of people of color, brings us back to that specificity of experience in the face of law and policy. And that gets you right down to the nitty-gritty of actual life. And political parties have not always paid close enough attention to those realities.
Okay, see someone right here.
I'm Palestinian, founder of Palestinian Christian Alliance for Peace. I'm not sure this is a question that can be answered through the lens of CRT, but you mentioned Ralph Bunche, and I note that Ralph Bunche was very much for the right of return of the Palestinians after 1948, even though he was a U.S. government employee. One question I have is how close he was to some of the founders of CRT or that tradition. The other question is that, so you also mentioned Du Bois, and he and other black leaders like the fire next time, Baldwin started out being really pro-Zionist because they saw the return of the Jews to the Holy Land, to the Promised Land, and they compared it to the idea of the return of Africans to Africa. But then they came to see what Israel was doing, say in Algeria, supporting the French against the Algerian people, and they and other things, and they became anti-Zionist. But how do you explain the fact that especially Pentecostal churches, African-American Pentecostal, there's a lot of support for Israel? Is that the kind of same narrative of return to the Holy Land, to the Promised Land, to...
So I'll do the shorter answer and you can elaborate. Sure. No, especially in Bell's tradition, because he was of the liberation theology tradition, and so he was very much more aligned with people who were exiled refugees, whether it was from the global south, like Paulo Freire was a huge influence on him. And they actually intersected at Harvard when Freire was exiled came to what he called the belly of the beast, came to the U.S. for one semester, I think, right before World Council of Churches whisked him off to Geneva. And in that moment, 1969, is when Freire was about to publish the English version of Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which, as much as you see biblical scripture epigraphs woven throughout Bell's work, you see probably second most is Paulo Freire's work, directly influential. The other, what else was I going to say? Go ahead and go, because I forgot.
So it is a little complicated to jump to those sets of questions, but they're not completely unrelated because race is deeply connected to the realities of the Israeli-Palestinian situation. You bunch, to start there, as the negotiator of the armistice lines, the Israeli chief negotiator who was sent to that process was Moshe Dayan, the eye patch guy. And Dayan, and so at the end of the negotiations, Bunch presented all the negotiators with commemorative plates to celebrate coming to an agreement where that green line would be, right? And Dayan asked him, what would you do with these plates if we weren't able to come to an agreement? And Bunch said, I was going to smash them on your head. A tough guy, right? And so this person, he was then in the UN circles. He was employed by the United Nations, not beholden to any U.S. policy at that point. Yeah. And he was directly connected to decolonization and independence efforts throughout Africa at the same time. So his decolonial focus was the driving force in his life. And Bell, throughout his work, also talks about decolonizing the mind. So decoloniality is the operative framework alongside liberation theology as a decolonial method and model to understand how these leaders are working in the world. Oh, you want to?
Yeah, and so we already spoke on the space traders, but one of the things that you'll find if you know to look for it in that famous story is a critique of Zionism, American Zionism in particular. And we found correspondence in his archive from people like Diane Ravitch criticizing him for that, being very offended that he would dare do that. In 1992 is when that was written, right? But he had been working on that story since the 1970s. And a lot of angry letters from other more prominent Zionists, right, who were just could not believe. But one of the other things we found that we've not had enough time to go through thoroughly, but is one of our plans for when we return to the archive, is that at the end of Bell's life, he has a folder about this thick about Black and Jewish relations, because he was writing about it in the early 2000s. Do you want to say more?
Sure, informed by people like James Cone, James Baldwin, and Louis Farrakhan. Mm-hmm. And so he was criticized during his life
about Farrakhan.
For speaking out to defend Farrakhan's focus on blackness and black independence and separatism, because black nationalism is a strand within Bell's thought and is a strand, therefore, within critical race theory. So this anti-assimilationist discourse, which is also tied with Native American liberation, the leave us alone principle, right? And so the white liberal preference for assimilation and homogenization is rejected in the critique of liberalism to say, no, we have to have a degree of separatism in order to maintain the distinctiveness of our identities. How dare you seek to take that away from us? So all of that, it's a very complex thought world, right?
But that same speech where he's defending Farrakhan, he's also, again, critiquing what's going on in the region, critiquing Zionism, if you remember.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So he's very aware of those things, just as he was preaching in Harvard Chapel against South African apartheid in 1977. He was critiquing apartheid policies in Israel in the 1990s. Mm-hmm. So this is, for him, a consistent set of analyses that I think we do well to consider. Now, as far as those other folks who were convinced that Zionism was a model of national liberation as opposed to a model of domination, a lot of folks changed their minds after 67, right? And there's been an effort to try to tell lies historically about Martin Luther King Jr.'s own perspectives on Zionism, to fabricate letters that King supposedly wrote that the King Foundation rejects as inauthentic. And so there's a lot of struggle. And currently, Black Palestinian solidarity is one of the most dynamic, emerging, and important transnational solidarities that we can consider. And so we need to be very careful as those models of solidarity get formed. Mm-hmm. So thanks for raising your points.
Any other questions? Okay, right here.
Maybe it's just a curiosity. I can't help but notice that you're both working on this work in red state academia. As a former Texan and familiar with Illinois politics and current Texas politics, I wonder if you might just reflect personally on what it is like to be working on this work in the current political climate, both nationally and kind of thinking about national funding for this sort of work, but also at the state level where, you know, Texas is getting rid of all DEI offices across their state institutions and things like that, if that, how you're navigating that or things that you're thinking about.
Yeah, that's a fabulous question. So I've personally been working on this since 2007 when I was being told by the Liberal Academy not to do this work because we were in a post-racial era in our society. Obama's president, after all, we're good. Don't you want a job? How are you going to get a job with this work? I persisted because of my love for the storytelling method that I really believed in, and so kept doing the work. And excuse my expletive, but the shit didn't really hit the fan until 2020. And that was the same year that I published my book on counter story, and by literally 4 days later, 4 days before, George Floyd had been murdered. The summer of Black Lives Matter exploded onto the scene, and by September is when Trump's executive order banning DEI but conflating it with CRT happened. And so in that moment, which is about the time we met each other, I experienced for the first time trolling, the nasty emails and messages sent to me, calling me a liar, an indoctrinator, an abuser of children, any number of things. I also experienced a record number of invitations to give talks to community audiences, not just academic audiences, and it was within COVID, so I could say yes to everything and do it over Zoom. But by the time the in-person events started resuming, by about 2021, 2022, this was the first time I would start my talk with a briefing from plainclothes police first to tell me how they were going to get me out of there if things went south. Yeah, it was also the moment, and Robert was witness to this, that the trolls would show up in person, and they were oftentimes younger white men who were infuriated, right, just breathing heavy, fist clenched, I mean, just really bodily, emanating this anger. So that's how it's been basically pre-2020, post-2020. This has been the norm. And so anything that is exploding onto the scene now is what we've kind of been getting a taste of since that first moment. One of the things in terms of funding, and then I'll hand it over to Robert, which I think is really hilarious, is that, yeah, a lot of the research that went into this book was self-funded because of the shrinking of research funds in Texas that happened well before this federal sort of issue has been happening. One thing we were able to write a grant for, though, is that if you look through the book, you'll notice there's a lot of images. And this was our first time publishing images in a book, and so we went through the process of how do we do this? Well, there's a particular image from a DC moment where Ted Cruz is waving Richard Delgado and Gene Stefansik's book in Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson's face during her confirmation hearing, grilling her about her daughter's school here in DC as well and their curriculum. It was Richard Delgado himself that insisted we put this in the book. And Jean was a little more hesitant, like, oh, do we want to call attention to ourselves in that way? And Richard said, it'll sell more books. Because that moment sold a lot of books for them. They shot to bestseller and a 4th edition because of this moment. But the hilarious part when it comes to funding about this photo is that it's a Getty Images photo. And so we had to find out how much that would cost. They said $400 for the kind of printing we wanted to do. So we kind of covertly asked University of North Texas for the funding. They get their funding from the state of Texas, and it got approved. And so the state of Texas paid for this photo.
Enough said, right? It's a terrible time in higher education everywhere, and it's been a more terrible time for a little bit longer in Texas and Florida. And so they were testing it all out on us before it came to all y'all. And so welcome to the party. And it's very difficult, but again, that's a cockroach move, right? That Asia just described. That's skittering around with your hard shell, and that's what we're learning to do. Almost all of our work has been self-funded. You know, getting to New York, the first time we went to the archive, we had to stay there less than a week because it's expensive. And like coming to DC, I don't know if you've noticed, but it's, we have been producing these things on a shoestring, but that's what we're used to doing because we don't do popular stuff.
For two more. Okay, so I think someone right here, and then you can go next.
Hello. I wanted to ask you, what is your response to the notion that embracing different cultures is divisive? I was at the African American Museum with my daughter yesterday here in DC. I'm a retired teacher of English language learners. And for 28 years, I enjoyed the multicultural nature of my profession, teaching students from Latin American cultures, Asian cultures, African cultures. I used to tell my students, we are one human family. And the connection with the whole gamut of people from around the world, it inspires me, it fills me. And then I heard from my good friend here, Rachel Grant, that our vice president is now in charge of the exhibits at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And I'm worried, and I'm sure other people are, and I see all kinds of people in the museum, white people, Asian people, Latin people, African American, African. People want to go to the museum because they want to know real, authentic history. They don't need it to be changed to make somebody feel well. So what is your response that somehow different cultures and learning about slavery, for example, is divisive?
So back to what Robert was saying about Derek Bell saying, tell the truth, people can handle it. One of the things that just happened when we were visiting Jackson, Mississippi is we, of course, went to pay, our respects to Medgar Evers, and we went to his house that's, now part of the national parks. One thing that you'll note in that house is there are still bullet holes from his assassination. And the Park Service worker who was there that day, a young black woman who told great stories, told us, one, she wasn't even supposed to be there that day, but because of all the cuts that have happened, she was the person who had to be at the house when she's not normally the person there. So that was serendipitous for us, but also indicative of our time of all these federal cuts. But what she also told us is that they're getting the mandate from this vice president of ours to sanitize the story of what happened there and to tell it in a way that doesn't offend anybody. Doesn't involve race, yeah. Okay, so tell the story of Medgar Evers' assassination. She's telling us this, and his driveway is like feet away. And the bullet holes are visible. So this is happening nationwide. I think, the Smithsonian is like the most egregious case, but even in places like this where there was like a literal thing that happened. I think the short answer is that the problem with difference is that we've made a problem of difference, right? Because and I'll hand this over to you after this, I was teaching at Syracuse University at one point, and we were talking about linguistic diversity, and I had a pre-MAGA type of student in my class raise his hand and say, but this nation has always been English only, and it's been a nation on English, and that's how the founding fathers envisioned it. And it was a moment to talk about history and to shed some truth and reality on the reality that our founding fathers spoke a lot of languages, and they had to because of the diplomatic capacities they were having to charter, right, as they built what became the nation that gave them the founding father mantle. And so we just listed as a class the minimum of what they might have been speaking just for the diplomatic reasons, but also what they were learning at their elite schools like Harvard and where else, right, Latin and, you know, what have you. And so that kind of deflated that student, and he left. He never came back because I don't know if it was just that he had nothing more to say or if it poked a hole in his worldview so bad that he couldn't face any of us ever again. But it was a strange moment for me because I wondered if it was a pedagogical failure actually on my part, where I wasn't actually able to bring him along with where the rest of the class was able to go with some truth, you know, the reality of what actually this nation was built on.
So a lot of the charge of divisiveness is related to legislative efforts that have been distributed throughout the United States by ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, to have state-level legislation, as was passed in Texas, that we can't, and Heritage Foundation, both founded by Paul Weyrich, another DC story. These efforts to ensure that no group is singled out for blame because nobody should be made to feel uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. And so this question, the weaponization of discomfort, right, is part of this divisiveness language. Now, we all know that the only group that might perceive itself as singled out for blame is white people, particularly white men. And so all of this legislation is in fact highly race conscious. It is highly gender conscious, in calling everyone else racist to protect the feelings of white men. I'm one of those. And I'm a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation, but I live and breathe and move through this world as a 6-foot-tall heterosexual white man, right? And that, I don't need that legislation to tell me how to feel about the truths of U.S. history. I need to be exposed to the truth, and I need to talk to other people who are affected by those historical truths in different ways than I have been, so that I can better move through this world of diversity. And it is disgusting to see this weaponization of whiteness, but it's also a strong reminder, as we started out this talk, saying we have been here before. This is no different than it has always been. And so we've convinced ourselves so many different times that we've been in bubbles, that things have gotten better and there's going to be no more retrenchment. But the retrenchment has always been there. And there's always been the effort, and now they happen to be sitting in the White House.
And the critical race theorists have always been on this. That's the thing, too, that's important about knowing their names, knowing their stories, is that the retrenchment topic was the first published paper by Kimberly Crenshaw. She was talking about in the 80s, the retrenchment that was happening there. The other thing is that when it comes to the think tanks, Crenshaw, Bell, Delgado, Stefancic have been following the Heritage Foundation in particular, right, for decades in terms of what, and they've been trying to scream from the rooftops that this is what is happening. One of the things that we, I think, realized through reading some of their work is that Project 2025 is the 9th iteration of these mandates. It's not the first, it's the 9th. And so this has been a decades-long writing process of perfecting what was originally, like a 1,300-page document down to this distilled, focused form that you see right now as Project 2025 by the Heritage Foundation. And so this has been something that has been, you know, on the move, long game, and the CRT folks have been pointing to it and saying, pay attention. The one last thing I'll say about our CRT folks that has been wonderful in relation to this conversation we're having, especially when it comes to whiteness, is I already mentioned the names of Ian Haney-Lopez and Cheryl Harris. The thing that teaching in Texas has been so great for, we call it the belly of the beast in a lot of ways, because we get a lot of the challenge and, you know, kind of questions and pushback from our own students. And the ones who are white that want to be uncomfortable or, you know, reject any of the sort of content on the basis of, well, I don't want to feel bad as a white person, the question I like to ask them, in line with what Haney Lopez and Cheryl Harris have done, is, well, when did your family become white? because that hasn't always meant the same thing, and it's always been decided by Supreme Courts, actually. And so in what generation, like what kind of white are you? And a lot of them are Polish and Irish and, you know, those sorts of descendants. And I'm saying, okay, so why are you so twisted about stuff that we're talking about that predates your family being white? Okay, that's something that you should really, you know, do some self thought and interrogation about. Go talk to your grandparents about when they became white. And stories have come back at us that, oh, actually, I'm white and I'm black. I just look white. You know, things like that. They're just like, oh my goodness, yeah. And so, but the when did you become white question is a really good pushback for the pushback.
Just on the last point, that the CRT folks have been tracking this from the beginning of the, again, the Heritage Foundation strategy that we're now, all of us are now caught up in. The other piece is that there have been recent books like Democracy in Chains and other types of books that seek to analyze the dynamics and the think tank structures, but they primarily do it through economic lenses while minimizing the racial components. And so now we need to reintroduce the racial analysis back into those structural analyses so we better understand the fullness of the challenge we face. So libertarian economics is tied to white supremacy, and that combination is now what's seeking to rule our lives.
And this will be our last question.
Hello, so my name is Laura Charleston, and I wanted to ask, are you concerned or worried that the book would fall victim to like book banning? I know that was mentioned before. And just, I'm also a junior at University of Maryland, and I can definitely see, like as a black student going to PWI, that critical race theory or anything regarding cultural competency would be greatly important for university ages or people of that kind of education also to know more about, and just as a general education of it. So just wondering if you guys are worried about that.
We hope it gets banned. Because that would be the best thing for the book, honestly, in terms of attention to it. Like, you lovely people are assuming are here because you're invested and interested. The fire and attention that will be brought to the book, even if it is to throw it in the fire, right, will still bring attention to the book. And so a ban would be great for us and has been great for many books, right? It creates that interest, especially nationally, for something that we're hoping can be very mainstream and not just stick with, you know, an audience that's part of the choir. As far as curriculum, though, I think it's the workarounds that, again, we've been taught by our ancestors and predecessors of how to still get the content into our academic spaces, like a PWI that might have, you know, be caving to these federal mandates. And so we, I think that's, I know I do, I think that's through the vehicle of counter story. And so just saying, no, these are just stories. We're just telling stories. And, you know, you don't always even believe our stories. So whatever, right? Like, it's just a story that's being brought into this space about Constance Baker Motley and Medgar Evers on this, like, car ride that they went on. And it's from this book, and it's a really exciting moment, but it doesn't have to be, I guess, advertised as like, oh, it's from this Originals of Critical Race Theory book, right? Like, we're just doing these stories, or we're teaching how to write these stories, or we're teaching the tenets, which isn't always the thing that the opponents are familiar with, right? So we're just doing this thing about social construction of whatever, right?
The best thing about teaching through story is that you'll see a class sitting there, and then somebody gets it. Somebody says, oh, this is about that. And you're like, yeah, it is. And then they turn to their classmate and say, hey, this is actually about race and how that's structured. This is about the US Constitution. And the students start talking, and that's the fire that catches hold in these conversations.
Well, okay, so I know we talk a lot about Derek Bell, but he's an exciting figure to us because his version of stories, like the one we've talked about quite a bit, Space Traders, it's like sci-fi, fantasy, you know, not real as far as how you could present it in a classroom. And he did that on purpose because he said he wanted to put as much distance between himself and his audience, so you suspend judgment and forget that a black man is even speaking. You're just focused on the content of the story. And he's in the tradition of, again, the people who tell stories that way. Okay, so Afrofuturist authors, people who are filmmakers and other sorts of artists. And so if you watch Black Mirror, if you watch The Twilight Zone, if you watch anything Jordan Peele has done, all right, this is exactly the vein that Derek Bell is in telling these things that are otherworldly. And so we don't have to say, oh, this is about the president, right? This is about some big key fascist figure that is a big lobster monster. I don't know, right?
But
You know,
it's actually, but the story is actually about the Hayes-Tilden Compromise that ended Reconstruction.
right.
That's what the story is actually about.
Yeah.
And so when you see his teaching notes accompanying the story, which are in the archive, then you know that.
Yeah.
But yeah, then you're right. Then you read it again, you're like, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
And that's what's so special about this method. And yeah, students can very much benefit from that.
Thank you all so much. We're just so thrilled to have been here with you all. And please come talk to us. We're hanging out for a while. Our plane doesn't leave till 10 p.m., so we're here.
Yes, and I want to thank you all also for joining us for the discussion. We do have a few copies left. We have about 5 copies left. But if you want to get a signed copy and we sell out, do not worry. We will still be able to get one to you, either shipped or you can come pick it up later. But we hope you have a great rest of your night. And we're going to have you to sit up here for the signing as well. Yeah, thank you.
Understand it finally. I'm trying to give you highs and you're planning how to